Welcome to another think tank hosted by Academus Education with affiliation with the Classical Association. Tonight we're joined by Meghji, who's going to be talking about feminist theory in classics and epic poetry in particular. Alex is reading for a Masters in Women's Studies at Balliol College, Oxford, and her research interests include classical reception, Homeric studies, postmodern English literature, and feminist theory. Her most recent publication, entitled It's Rape, Not Romance, The Insidious Anti-Feminisms of Fairy Tales and Their Reception, explores several of these themes. She was a panellist at the University of Oxford's After Modernism seminar series and is co-chair of the University of Oxford Feminist Thinking Conference. She hopes to pursue doctoral work on feminist phenomenology and Greek literature. Over to you, Alex.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the role of feminist theory in classics in general and in understanding epic poetry in particular. My name is Alexandra Meghji. I'm a master's candidate at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm reading for my degree in women's studies. So my current research is on class roles in feminist retellings and novelizations of Homer. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with you all today, but I'm really excited that I can still share my thoughts with you. So, having studied classics during my undergrad and women's studies during my master's, as I said, I've become really interested in the way that we can mobilize feminist theory to revisit and perhaps reinterpret the way that we understand ancient texts and the role of women in them. And I'm going to try and articulate some of those dimensions today. So, in this lecture, I want to establish three things. Firstly, I want to challenge disciplinarity in a university, and I want to identify male hegemony in classical scholarship and in the way that we study and teach classics. Secondly, I want to show you how feminist theory can be a critical and revisionist lens through which we can look at ancient texts with a completely fresh perspective. And lastly, I want to give you some examples of how this manifests in Homer, seeing as that's my area of research. So to begin, the disciplinary structure in universities is facing a lot of challenges by more interdisciplinary fields of study, like, for example, women's studies. Students and scholars are kind of coming to understand that disciplinarity, which simply implies the structure of an institution into distinctive disciplines, like, for example, English, modern languages, classics, history, philosophy, psychology, etc., is actually very rigid and limiting. Under a disciplinary structure, we are kind of discouraged from doing research across various fields and linking them together. So, for example, a comparison of the Odyssey to a modern novel sounds like an amazing project, but that's a combination of English and classics. And so for a really long time in scholarship, that wasn't really encouraged because it kind of transgressed these very rigid disciplinary boundaries. So again, that kind of project, even though it sounds really fruitful and really generative, didn't fit into the university. And so you can see how that would have been a really limiting kind of force in the institution. So under a disciplinary structure, we really are just quite confined as scholars. The interesting thing about classics as well is that it's naturally quite an interdisciplinary field of study. We have ancient philosophy and ancient history, linguistics, psychology, literature, and so many other fields all underneath this umbrella that we deem classics. But what's happened for so long is that classical scholars have limited the discipline of what we call classics to predominantly Greek and Latin literature and language. And as a result, classical scholars have kind of problematized interdisciplinarity, if you understand what I mean. So they've made it such that this kind of rote, rigid, disciplinary, and traditional, read white male and elite, effectively, study of classical texts is the most important and is seen as the most worthy, whilst ignoring the concerns of interdisciplinarity and intersectionality in the fields. And this is changing quite a bit with reception, but the changes, relative to the history of the study of classics, which is millennia, is very new. It's only in the last few decades or so. So to build on this, women's studies or gender studies or whatever you'd like to call it, because universities do differ on this, which is effectively, the study of women, femininity, sexuality, gender, is without question an interdisciplinary way to study. On one hand, I could look at the history of women's health, or I could look at women's novels from the 19th century, or I could look at suffrage history, or so many other things. Women's studies naturally spans many different disciplines and time periods and political frameworks. And women's studies can be, in classics, a kind of classical reception. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But what I want to establish here effectively is that on one hand, you could have a disciplinary university in which classical reception scholarship, including the study of women, doesn't take place because it's not really considered appropriate or worthy. Or you can have an interdisciplinary university in which scholars are free to investigate ancient texts with reference to other time periods and disciplines and create really generative cross-disciplinary discussions and discourses and kind of forge new ground. And this is what we're working towards, which is really fantastic. And it is happening. But I just want to identify that the kind of history of the university prevented this disciplinary discourse from occurring for a really long time. So basically what I'm trying to get across is that the structure of the university into disciplines means that women's studies and the study of women in classics doesn't really, or hasn't for a long time, have a solid foundation in the institution. It doesn't have a solid place, effectively. And this is a problem, inevitably, because it stops intellectual and cultural production. But classics is a really interesting subject within which to be a feminist as well, because it demands that we engage with a corpus of texts with, mostly male authors in it. I suppose except for Sappho, but, some scholars are of the view that Sappho is just a male fantasy anyway, so her work isn't tapping into a real kind of phenomenological woman's experience. So anyway, I digress. Not only are we in classics looking at works by and about men, which are, if not openly misogynistic, then certainly androcentric, we're also looking at texts that are kind of analyzed by millennia of male scholarship. And that male scholarship forms the basis of traditional readings of these texts, which are inevitably, again, if not openly misogynistic, very androcentric. And these traditions certainly don't give women in classics their due attention. And if they do, it's through a kind of, exceptionalistic and fantastical patriarchal lens. And even though there are more women in classics now, which is absolutely amazing, there is also a culture in academic settings of classics still being very male and still being a very elite subject and a kind of cultural emblem of aristocracy and a gatekeeper of, who has access to education and who doesn't. And that aura still kind of informs the way that classical studies exist and kind of what classics stands for as a discipline. And luckily, again, this is undergoing a huge revolution and has been for some years now, and is being massively democratized and decolonized, and that is really fantastic. So now what I want to show you is that feminist theory and queer theory as well, which is arguably a branch of feminist theory, are great critical lenses through which we can examine ancient texts in a more revisionist and a more sensitive way. So the feminist classical enterprise was started in the late 20th century by a number of female thinkers, predominantly in the US and the UK. I suppose in France as well, with the kind of French postmodern feminist movement. So some of these scholars include Miriam Leonard, Maria Wyke, Judith Hallett, Barbara Gold, Helen Foley, Shelley Haley, Nancy Rabinowitz. I could go on, but if you remember any of those, look them up because they are really fantastic. And so many more. So these scholars have been preoccupied with, as Barbara Gold really eloquently puts it, reading woman into ancient texts. And that means basically figuring out the position of both the life and the literature of women in Greece and Rome. And feminist theory has been used by these scholars as a lens through which to look mainly at two subjects within classics: Roman love poetry and Greek tragedy. We see, for example, that Antigone becomes the kind of philosophical battleground, I suppose, for women's agency and political resistance. However, French feminism has also used ancient texts as a basis for its own analytic project. For example, in Helen Sixou's The Laugh of the Medusa, and in the philosophy of the famous French theorist Lucie Irigaray. So anyway, feminist theory is a fantastic way to look at ancient texts in an original, more critical way, and it lets us reject the kind of traditional understandings of antiquity that, kind of subordinate women or contribute to the subordination of women, and show that women in Greece and Rome were certainly more complex, nuanced, and important than male scholarship gives them credit for. So while tragedy and elegy are kind of the original, shall we say, foundational subjects for feminist theory, Homer is getting a lot more feminist attention right now. And this is happening in both academia and literature, and this is really exciting. So, for example, one of the most kind of prominent examples is Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which was published in 2017. And she's the first woman to translate this canonical text into English. And it's certainly a revolutionary, truly feminist reading. I don't know if you've read it, but definitely check it out. Because it is very kind of subversive, inherently. You know, she's become quite well known for her translation of Odysseus's female slaves, whom he hangs in book 22 of the Odyssey because they had relations with Penelope's suitors. And she translates them as slave women rather than the conventional male translation of them as maids, which certainly kind of sugarcoats their position in Homeric society. And so in this translation, in identifying these women as slaves, you know, using the actual word slave, she exposes the kind of patriarchal and euphemistic tradition of translation and demands that readers understand clearly and accurately the position of these women in the narrative, you know, acknowledging their slave status and acknowledging that Odysseus was not indubitably justified in hanging these women because they were in many cases raped by Penelope's suitors. And Emily Wilson really kind of rawly and grittily taps into that, which is really refreshing, actually, and really bold and brave and accurate. So this increased sensitivity to feminist philology is happening right now, which is amazing and really exciting and just absolutely fantastic for the field. And in a similar vein, feminist revisitations of Homer are happening in literary form through the kind of massive surge in Homeric novelizations that we have seen recently. Some of these titles include The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, Madeline Miller's Circe, Natalie Haynes's A Thousand Ships and the Song of Achilles, Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, and so many more. And the aim of these novelizations is to elevate Homer's women from their marginal and supplementary positions in epic into the center of the narrative, and to give them a full humanity and a more complete story than they are afforded in epic poetry. And in this way, they reject the unidimensionality of women in epic, and their kind of conventional, patriarchal, androcentric, misogynistic even portrayals. So, for example, in Madeline Miller's novel Circe, we don't see the same character, Circe, as we do in Homer. You know, she isn't just this evil seductress trying to hamper Odysseus' return to Ithaca. Rather, she is an individual with her own needs and desires and her own identity, independent of her relationship with Odysseus. Similarly, in Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, we get a fuller picture of Penelope's character than the Penelope in Homer, who you know, as some scholars would argue, embodies merely the trope of the faithful wife. So novelizations of Homer show that Homer's women are far more complicated and individual and independent than epic gives them credit for. And, you know, there's so many more of these novelizations coming out, and they're starting to receive scholarly attention, which is really exciting for the future of classics, and I think really what it needs to survive in this more interdisciplinary academic future that we in universities are working towards. So lastly, I want to talk about queer theory, and this is also a really fruitful lens for feminist approaches to Homer because it reveals previously ignored complexities in gender representation in epic poetry. So the primary aim of queer theory is to challenge normativity and to undermine power in structures that manifest through sexual difference. So a feminist perspective on Homer benefits from queer theory because it is a useful tool with which to investigate the normativity or lack thereof of women in epic in relation to their representations and in relation to their power. So before I explore the application of queer theory to epic poetry, I want to just explain the term queer in its theoretical and epistemological implications in academia. So basically what I mean by queer is deviation from normativity, and this is an academic translation or kind of understanding of it, I suppose. So the lens of queer studies is epistemologically very generative. It's a kind of privileged site for the explicit reconsideration of disciplinarity and knowledge production, according to Jose Esteban Munoz. And it is a very useful instrument, effectively, for reading women into ancient texts and for reinterpreting antiquity through a modern feminist framework. It's important to note that queer theory is not a narrow hermeneutic at all. The term queer in academia is not merely applicable to non-heterosexual subjects. Rather, it refers to any individual who diverges from heteronormativity. In this way, therefore, heterosexual subjects in the modern Anglo-American world might be deemed queer if they swerve from normativity in any way. For example, heterosexual queerness might manifest in, unmarried cohabitation or single motherhood or, female authority in the workplace or anything that kind of history hasn't deemed normative or normal or the norm. So anyway, female normativity in Homer isn't ambiguous at all. The Homeric woman is subordinate to men. She's politically and sexually powerless. She's socially silent, and she's generally circumscribed. So she's an object of masculine desire, and, as obviously demonstrated in the Iliad, she's a male military prize. So Chryseis, Briseis, and Andromache are all examples of female normativity in Homer. Briseis' situation, for example, demonstrates the ability of war to reduce women to possessions, and the normative inability of these women to escape their fate of objectification, basically. Andromache similarly exemplifies normativity, but as a faithful wife. She's exclusively faithful to Hector. She's solicitous for her child, Astyanax. She tries to keep her husband from battle, and she lacks agency to prevent her future fate as a captive of war. Helen's character as well is a real opus for queer theory. Rachel Lesser, who's a very prominent Homeric scholar these days, argues that the Homeric narrator identifies Helen as a queer subject in both the Iliad and Odyssey on account of her effective deviation from gendered and sexual normativity. Helen's character is destructive. She departs from normative sexual behavior, and this obviously manifests in her withdrawal to Troy with Paris. That's obviously the most significant and consequential act of queerness on Helen's part. And she contrasts Chryseis and Briseis and Andromache, for example, who are silent and controlled by their male captors. Helen defies both normative silence by existing as a speaking subject, and she defies normative sexuality through her what seems to be sexual self-determinism. It's interesting as well that Helen's agency almost is derived in part by her self-identification as a queer subject. In the Iliad, she assumes responsibility for the Trojan War, whereas the male characters in the Iliad don't blame her for it. And her assumption of responsibility for the Trojan War actually destabilizes her identity as a victim of male violence, or as a pawn of war, and highlights her own self-determinism and her own agency to affect change and make her own choices. The Achaeans have to kind of deny that Helen is culpable because it serves their own heroic interests. If they can assure that Helen is an innocent pawn of war and that she had no doing in this, then basically their own position is such that they can, save the archetypal, read normative, helpless woman, thereby assuring their own male acquisition of kleos and bolstering their masculine heroic superiority. Helen's culpability, though, when she identifies that she is the cause of war, undermines the heroism of the Achaeans' enterprise in two ways. They have less control over the situation, and they're not operating within a purely normative justice model. And Helen's self-blame tarnishes her own reputation and worth in the male eyes, which thereby invalidates the kind of necessity of rescuing her. So basically, her queerness really complicates this kind of justice framework within which everyone is working in the Trojan War. So the self-blame that actually guarantees Helen's guilt works to her advantage, neutralizing her transgression and assuring her protection, basically. And it's an exercise of power, albeit within the confines of, the incredibly limited sphere of action available to women. So these examples are just to show you how queer theory can kind of help us rework the way we understand Homer. And so yeah, some scholars that you can take a look at if you're interested in the use of queer theory in epic poetry or in the analysis of Homer are Rachel Lesser, Jose Esteban Munoz, Marilyn Arthur, Marilyn Katz, and Nancy Rabinowitz. So anyway, all is to say that while classics is historically very male, very exclusive, and very patriarchal, the discipline is rapidly changing, and this is because of the use of feminist theory and queer theory in classics, which is revolutionizing the way that we read and think about and teach and understand ancient texts. And through novelizations, classics is becoming more accessible, and we are in our daily lives and studies in a more critical and revisionist dialogue with antiquity, which is really generative and really exciting and a really fruitful way to think. And this is kind of where classics is going. And
Thanks. You've just listened to Alexandra Meghji on feminist theory in classics and epic poetry. If you've enjoyed this think tank and want to find out more, make sure to follow our social media links that you can see on screen now to be kept up to date on future think tanks, summer schools and crash courses. Thanks everyone. Bye.